The moon is one of the most recognizable objects in the sky, and every now and then it makes its presence known to us. And now that cameras are more easily accessible these days, we sometimes cannot help but take pictures of the moon. But instead of getting a detailed photo of the moon, instead what we get is a white blob where the moon is supposed to be. And so if you're still a beginner in moon photography, in today's video I will show you how to create a detailed photo of the moon using either a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, or a smartphone. So as for smartphones, I use a Huawei P20 Lite, by the way. You can orient your camera towards the moon and then take pictures of it. Although I would not suggest that you use the digital zoom on your phone because that is not actual zoom at all. You don't get more detail from digital zoom compared to actual zoom because digital zoom is not actual zoom. Digital zoom is like zooming around an image that you've already taken and it's already in your gallery. You don't get more detail from them. Instead, all that you're doing is zooming in on the details that your camera has already captured without getting more detail out of those areas. Now there are many ways for you to do actual zoom. The first one is by using zoom lenses for smartphone cameras. A zoom lens that has a very high focal length. The higher the focal length, the better. Although take note, the higher the focal length of the zoom lens that you use for your smartphone, the more zoomed in the image will be, and the vibrations of movements become more amplified. So even the slightest of vibrations or the slightest of movements will be visible in your image. So you can either mount your smartphone on a tripod to keep it as stable as possible, or if you don't have one, you can just improvise and orient it towards the moon. You can get zoom lenses online, or you can also buy them from stores near you. But either way, use a zoom lens that has a very high focal length. Also take note, the more the focal length, the heavier the zoom lens will be and the more demand it will put in your phone. And if you don't have a tripod, it'll be a lot trickier for you to minimize the vibrations as much as possible and get a sharp image of the moon. So I've seen some people take some good images of the moon handheld, but I would not genuinely recommend it. So if you have a good solid tripod, definitely use it. Getting a good photo of the moon is all about stability, and we don't want camera shake. That's what tripods are for. And it's also going to make your life a whole lot easier when you're moving around. And so another way for you to photograph the moon in great detail using something that has a very long focal length is by attaching your phone on some binoculars. Although it's still the same thing. The more the focal length of your binoculars, the more zoomed in the image will be, and even the slightest of movements and vibrations will be visible in your image. So in order to prevent that, you have to get a tripod for binoculars. Yes, there's a thing for that too. And then mount your phone onto the binoculars. You can use an adapter like the universal digiscoping smartphone adapter, and then mount your phone on the binoculars by using an adapter or just by doing it handheld and take pictures of the moon through those binoculars. But if you don't have a tripod, you can just improvise, but a tripod really does make things a whole lot easier for you. After that, binoculars, another more popular method of photographing the moon is by using your telescope and then mounting your phone onto the eyepiece and then taking pictures of the moon like so. But you can also use an adapter like this, the universal digiscoping smartphone adapter. Mount your phone onto this and then put it on the eyepiece. My adapter, by the way, is broken. So you no longer have to handheld your phone on the eyepiece, allowing you to have greater freedom on your shots without having to handheld your device on the eyepiece. And doing it like this allows you to make your image as stable as possible. So as for the telescope, I use the Celestion Astromaster LT60AZ that has a focal length of 700mm. And if you're still going to buy a telescope yourself, a focal length of 700mm is already fine, but don't go for huge numbers like 3000mm because that provides a lot of zoom that the moon itself just won't fit into your image. And so instead you will create a mosaic of the moon just to get the entire lunar disk, which will make things a lot harder for you. Although if you use a telescope that has a very low focal length, you can use Barlow lenses, which allow you to double the focal length of your telescope depending on the Barlow lens that you use, like this 5 times Barlow lens here that amplifies the focal length of your telescope 5 times. Although take note, don't use a Barlow lens that has a very high magnification, otherwise you'll end up with the moon that cannot fit onto your perspective here through this telescope. So I would suggest an app called Telescope Calculator that allows you to put in the model of your telescope and the eyepieces that you're using, as well as the Barlow lenses, in case you have any, to simulate what the field of view will be like. And in that way, it will allow you to determine how big the moon will be in your field of view. Also, with an adapter like this, like the universal digiscoping smartphone adapter, it already opens up a myriad of opportunities for you when it comes to astrophotography through your telescope. You can do planetary photography even better, and you can also do deep sky astrophotography, although your images will not be that detailed because you will need the tracking for that. As for telescopes like the one that I have, the Celestron LT60A is a telescope. It's just a manual telescope, so there's nothing automated about this. Now, as for the settings, I typically set the ISO to automatic, and the shutter speed to automatic as well. But the exposure value, I tend to set it to negative 0.3 or negative 0.7. And as for the focus, I tend to use manual focus and adjust the focus until the moon comes into proper focus. Now, as for the white balance, I typically use daylight white balance, or set the white balance to between 43K to 45K. Now, before you take pictures of the moon through your telescope, set a timer between 5 seconds or 10 seconds to avoid vibrations and to make your moon image as sharp as possible. Now, I also tap on the moon on my smartphone to make sure that the moon is properly exposed and at the same time properly focused. But to make sure that the moon is properly focused, I can either adjust the focus wheel on my telescope or adjust the focus of my smartphone using manual focus, and then make sure to make the moon as focused as possible. Another way that you can take good pictures of the moon is by using a DSLR camera or a mirrorless camera. I use a DSLR camera, more specifically a Canon EOS 700D. Although take note, most of the things that I'll be talking about when it comes to this portion of the video will be about Canon cameras, but most of the techniques used to photograph the moon can apply to other camera brands. Also, if you've mounted your camera on a tripod, make sure that everything is tightened, otherwise your camera will shake, even with the slightest movement, and you will not be able to properly light your camera on the moon. So tighten everything up. And don't use the center column of your camera tripod. Although it'll feel like it's good to raise your camera a bit higher, but that is when it becomes more unstable. So don't use the center column ever. Also, if your camera has a built-in image stabilization, turn it off. If your camera lens has image stabilization or vibration reduction, turn it off. Those features are only good when you're holding the camera, but on a tripod you don't need them, and sometimes they can work against you. Another way to remove vibrations is by using a remote shutter or by enabling the touch to enable shutter feature on your camera, especially if you're using a DSLR camera. But if you don't have a remote shutter or enable touch to enable shutter feature, every camera has a built-in self-timer, so use that feature. To set up the self-timer in your Canon camera, you simply have to press this button here right where the self-timer symbol is located. And then choose either 10 seconds, 2 seconds, or continuous. This will allow you to choose the number of images that your camera will have to take with a 10-second delay before your camera starts taking pictures. Also, when you take pictures of the moon, make sure to set the focus to manual focus instead of autofocus. And then use this focus ring here to properly focus on the moon. And one way you can photograph the moon in great detail is by using a camera lens, or whether it be a prime lens or a telephoto lens, as long as it has a very high focal length. Like a camera lens that has a focal length of 300mm, but the more the better. So in case you might wonder, the camera lens that I use here is an EFS 18 to 55mm telephoto lens. It really allows me to take good pictures of the moon, but not as in award-winning images. So I would suggest that you buy a camera lens, more preferably a telephoto lens, that is within your budget and has a very high focal length, more than 55mm. The more the better. To shoot the moon, you're probably gonna need a minimum of 200mm focal length. Although, take note, the more the focal length of a camera lens, the bigger it gets and the heavier it will become, which means that it will put more demand on your camera. And also, don't forget, the more zoomed in you are on the image, even the slightest movements will become amplified in your image and it'll become visible. So one way to prevent that is by mounting your camera on a tripod here to keep it as stable as possible, but if you don't have one, you can just improvise. But a tripod really does make things a whole lot easier for you. Now, another way to photograph the moon is by attaching your DSLR camera or mirrorless camera onto your telescope. And to do this, you will need to have these two things, which is the T-ring and the T-adapter. I bought these things online from Shopee, but you can also find them on Lazada or Amazon, or you can just find them in stores near you. So what these two accessories do is that they allow you to attach your DSLR camera or mirrorless camera onto your telescope. So you have to attach these two pieces together, like such. You have to remove the lens of your camera and then attach this to where the camera lens attaches. there's a red dot here that aligns with a red dot on your camera. And then you attach it like so. Like this. And afterward, you remove the diagonal. And then attach your DSLR camera or mirrorless camera onto your telescope. Like such. Now you can focus your live view or look at the image through this. And take some test exposures to see whether or not you're properly focused and whether or not you're using the right settings. Now as for the white balance, I use daylight white balance. And also make sure that you're shooting in raw image format to get the most detail out of your images of the moon to process them later on. Now as usual, before I take pictures of the moon using my DSLR camera, I set a timer around 2 or 10 seconds to cancel out as much vibrations as possible. Now as for the settings, I typically use ISO 800 and I adjust the shutter speed until the moon is properly exposed. And when that's done, I adjust the focus wheel on the telescope here and then carefully adjust it until the moon comes into proper focus. Although, you have to take note that if you do it like this, depending on the kind of camera that you use, it'll put a lot of strain on your focuser. Say for example, if the moon is already very high up in the sky and you want to take pictures of it using this method, it will put a lot of strain on your telescope focuser, and as a result, it will pull on your camera will pull on your telescope's focuser and your telescope will go out of focus. So what I did to stop that from happening is that I use rubber bands and put it onto the focus wheels here to secure them in place when they find proper focus. I adjust the wheels a little bit after I secure it with rubber bands to make sure that I still got the right focus. Also, to more properly focus on the moon, you'll have to zoom in on the moon using the plus and minus buttons on your camera to do digital zoom. And then slowly but surely adjust the focus ring of your camera or the focus wheel of the telescope. But if you end up with an image that is noticeably brighter than what you can see in your live view, try to lower the shutter speed a little bit more until the moon is very dark in your live view. And try to take some text exposures and try to see if the moon is now properly exposed. Also, instead of just taking a few exposures of the moon and then directly editing them on Photoshop or Lightroom, I would suggest that you take multiple exposures of the moon, as in hundreds of them. Or more preferably, you can record the moon and then put them on programs like PIP, which is short for Planetary Imaging Preprocessor, and then putting them on stacking programs like Registack 6 or AutoStack 3. This method allows you to get more detail from the moon than what you can get by just editing moon images directly in Photoshop or Lightroom. Because Lucky Imaging isolates those moments in your images or in your video footage where atmospheric disturbance is at its least. And programs like AutoStack or Registack stacks those images on top of each other to create a sharpened image, thus allowing you to get more detail of the moon than what you can get without Lucky Imaging. So yes, you will need a PC or a laptop for this. Afterward, you can edit your images in Lightroom or Photoshop, and I will provide a link to another video as to how you can sharpen your images of the moon using Photoshop. But if that doesn't work for you, you can just use Photoshop's Adobe Camera Raw filter and then adjust some things there to get the most detail out of the moon, especially the sharpening and the texture adjustments. But you have to play with the other adjustments in Adobe Camera Raw filter to get the most detail out of your moon images. You can also do Lucky Imaging not just with your DSLR or mirrorless camera, you can also do it on smartphones. Also, you'd have to transfer the file to your computer in order to do Lucky Imaging, to process them in softwares like PIP and AutoStack or Registacks. Although I use AutoStack 3, but take note, not all versions of AutoStack works for some people. But as for me, I use AutoStack 3. Lucky Imaging already allows you to do more things. Lucky Imaging is not just isolated to moon photography. It already allows you to get more detail in your planetary photography on planets like Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, you name it. But that's going to be another topic altogether. So one of the best ways to improve your moon photography is by stacking using Lucky Imaging, whether you're using a smartphone or a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. Shooting through a zoom lens or a telescope or binoculars or telephoto lenses or prime lenses. With Lucky Imaging, you can get more detail from your moon images than what you can get with just directly editing your images in Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop without using Lucky Imaging. Now, before I wrap up this video, there are a couple of things that I would like to mention. First of all, the moon is moving across the sky, so there might be a point where the moon will move out of your focus point, it will be out of focus, and so you'll have to adjust your camera or tripod or telescope a bit. So as for aperture, camera lenses have this sweet spot where you can capture more detail on the moon, and this usually falls between f11 to f16. So try to play with it. and determine what aperture setting is best for you. And also make sure that you're shooting in raw image format to get the most detail out of your images. And you will also find that the moon will get a bit clearer the further up the horizon it rises. And the final thing that we need is clear skies. Cloudy skies won't work. So if you found this video useful, don't forget to like it, subscribe to me, and share it to whoever might find it useful. And if you're planning to enjoy the night sky anytime soon, I wish good luck and clear skies.